Okay, this second and final game that we're going to look at in the case of a good bishop versus a bad knight, I really love as an example. And one of the reasons I love it is because we begin with a position which is actually approximately equal. After the moves rook 8 to d8 and knight to d5, this is the position that we're looking at. However, at first sight, what I really like about this position is that it would appear like white is the one with the superior minor piece. He has a very stable, well-supported, centralized knight. Whereas the black bishop is sort of on the king's side, not really pointing at anywhere other than the d1 square is kind of relevant because a rook might go there. But in general, I mean, it would appear that this knight is a superior piece. And, well, the reality is that it is around an equal position. However, black has perhaps an easier plan. White, in the starting position, to my eyes, should probably try and centralize his king somewhat and maybe try and make some use of this queenside pawn majority here. But it's not easy because the white king, as it turns out, is slightly less safe. And in an open position, the bishop can combine very, very effectively in the hunt against the white king with the rooks, perhaps even more effectively than a knight can combine with the rooks, even though a knight and rook combine quite well. In addition to this, it's Fischer's move, and in his first move he plays bishop to e6, and so we have a situation where at any given moment the bishop can actually trade itself off for the white knight, whereas the same cannot be said of the knight. Having said that, right now there's no intent for black to capture this knight, because after a move such as c takes or perhaps even e takes d5, we would have 4 pawns like this on the queen side, and we would have a protected passed pawn, and so this would be very dangerous for black. However, after rook h to d1, Fischer continues in excellent, very precise fashion with this move f5. And so now we begin to spot the chinks in white's armor here, because now we kind of begin to realize the cracks in the facade for white, which is, at first sight, it would appear that this knight in the original position, here after knight to d5, it would appear that this knight is as stable as can be. However, notice that f5 is an option targeting this e4 defender, and also it may be the case that b5 is an option which would target the c4 defender. And so the white knight is supported, well supported and centralized and stable, but one very important detail for now, it's not a permanent outpost like in that first game that we saw where the knight was superior, because it had the outpost of d4, which was a permanent protected outpost that could not be challenged. Whereas here, it's a temporary outpost. And so Fischer immediately proceeds to challenge it. Bishop to e6, rook d1, and now f5. E takes f5, g takes f5. And we notice that that isolated pawn has been removed, but on the other hand, black now has these sort of hanging pawns in the center. One of the benefits is that they cover a very, very large collection of important central squares. And so here it prevents the white king from activating itself very effectively in the center. White now played the move rook to d2, and black's king enters the fray, king f7, rook c to d1, rook d7. Notice how black is aiming to plant both rooks here and all challenging this knight on d5, and at some point still keeping the possibility of b5 in mind. One thing worth noting is king f7 is again an important relationship between the knight and the king, because any time that you're trying to work against a knight, you should keep in mind the possibility of planting pieces on that 3-square diagonal for the knight. So here on b3, on b7, on f3, and on f7, why is this an important square? Because, well, on the one hand, heavy pieces like a queen can actually be immediately targeting the knight, but even a king is very near. In terms of, normal distance, it's very, very near. It's only 1 square away from the knight. But in terms of immunity, to the knight's attack, it's actually very, very safe. And what do I mean by this? Well, because if the knight wanted to, let's say, check the king, it would take 3 moves at a minimum before it could do so. For example, one route is knight b4, knight d3, and knight takes e5. And at this point, it would be in check. And the reason why it takes 3 moves is because it would take 4 moves total for the knight to be able to transfer to any of these squares that are diagonally placed. And so this is a very important thing to keep in mind. The black king now is extremely safe from any checks. It will take a minimum of 3 knight moves before the black king can be checked. And we see that this is not just a kind of a nice benefit to keep in the back pocket, but actually in this particular position, black's intent is to double up on the d file in order to challenge the knight. And so this is actually a necessity, because had he started with, let's say, rook to d7 instead, then after rook to d1, if he were to now play the move rook f to d8, this would be a huge blunder, knight f6 check, and the rook is falling. So king f7 is part of the plan, a bit of prophylaxis there and improving his pieces. And of course also, as we move towards endgames, we want that activity, that centralization of the king. So rook c to d1, rook d7, knight to c3, and now rook f to d8. Rook takes rook, rook takes rook, rook takes rook, and bishop takes rook. So we have a mass liquidation, and now we have that pure bishop and knight, bishop versus knight endgame. White now plays b4. Still, the position should be tenable for white, but it's a little bit more complicated to play the white side than it is the black side, or a lot more complicated. And Fischer proceeds very precisely. He plays the move pawn to b6. I want to draw your attention to one thing. Notice how Fischer is placing his pawns. Unlike in the first game, placing those pawns on the same color as your bishop is a very bad idea. Here, Fischer has one of his central pawns on a dark square, and we notice these pawns on the queen side. He is advancing them not on the light squares, but on the dark squares instead. In this position, Wolfgang Uhlmann should have continued with a move like king to e3. And yeah, it's not clear exactly how black is going to press his advantage. Probably the plan would be king to e6, maybe at some point bishop to c6. Again, notice if the bishop goes on c6, the knight is on c3. The bishop facing the knight along rank and file with 2 squares in between, very important. And that bishop there would control a lot of the forward jumps of the knight. So bishop to c6 probably at some point would feature in the plan. Maybe some f4 advance at some point and centralizing the king. But it wouldn't be easy because white would likely place the pawn on g3, covering the f4 square with his g-pawn, therefore making the advance along the right set of squares, which is those dark squares, making it very challenging for black to advance them correctly. And of course, black would be hesitant to advance along the light squares because that could, potentially harm his chances very severely, actually, and leave himself with a bad minor piece. Because, as mentioned in the very beginning, structural considerations and the way the color complex along which your pawns are placed and the quality of the minor piece that you possess, these two things are inextricably linked. So after king e3, as I say, it could have been, well, probably 2 results, a draw or a loss for white, but quite possibly closer to the draw than to the loss. However, he makes a big mistake, and he plays this move a4. And the problem with this move is that, first of all, you're advancing the pawn and you're making it a more ready target. That's an easier target of the bishop. The bishop is already pointing at the pawn. And secondly, the black king may at some point begin its march over to the queen side, and it will be easier to access a pawn on a4 than a pawn on a2. And as we know, these kind of endgames may at any given moment be transformed into pure king and pawn endgames, in which case fastest to promote is often the decisive factor. So this is a big mistake by white, and I think it's actually the losing mistake. Now, the other important point is that by placing the pawn here on a4, there's no possibility to play a3 at any given moment. And so had he, for example, played a move such as g3, and black were to play some kind of move like a5 targeting this pawn, white would in general not wish to plant his pawns like this, because notice all his pawns are on light squares, and so that makes it very, very easy for black's bishop to come in and hoover them up. but he would continue to have the option of playing a3. And after pawn takes, notice that first of all, the material has been reduced, which is usually, as we saw in the last game, and in fact in the first game also, usually this improves the possibility of a draw, obtaining the desired result. And in addition to this, what's more important is that these pawns operate similarly to the pawns on f5 and e5. So we see that they're controlling a lot of squares, preventing the activation of the black king. And just in general, it's a more compact structure. And it's also flexible, so it can move along the dark squares as well, which would make them immune to the attack of this bishop on d7. So therefore, this was a very, very important moment of the game, and I think the critical mistake, a4. Now, black plays bishop to e6, immediately targeting the pawn on c4, which now cannot be defended via e3 and d3. And now white plays the move pawn to c5. This is forced. B takes c5, b takes c5, and king comes over to e7. Probably by now, there really is absolutely nothing to be done, but white's next move compounds his problems. He plays the move in this position, king to g3. Now, I want to just maybe comment one thing, which is this move, bishop to e6, the idea is that by forcing the advance of the pawn, this pawn is just a much easier pawn to target. So notice how Fischer actually forces an advance of this queenside pawn, while on the other hand, he's aware of the benefit of getting the white pawns to advance, whereas Uhlmann actually helps him with, in the case of the a pawn, which he could not have forced the advance of that pawn as easily. So okay, so black goes king to e7, white goes king to g3, and now black plays king to d7. So the idea is white is trying to play the same game as black, which is black will chase after the white queenside pawns, and white will try to chase after the black kingside pawns. But the black kingside pawns are much more compact and therefore harder to target, and the black bishop is a superior piece. And also the black king, since after king h4, king to c6, the black king is already more advanced than the white king, because although the black king may only be on his third rank, as we can see, and the white king is, more advanced in the sense that he's on the fourth rank, that's not the essential question. The essential question is how close to the enemy pawns are the kings. And we see that this king is already threatening to capture, and that is not the case for white. White plays king to g5, but even here he's still not threatening to capture anything since the pawn is protected. Black now advanced his e-pawn. Again, under normal circumstances, black would prefer to push along the dark squares, but the threat is the move king to f6 with a double attack. And in the event of a move such as f4, well, king to f6 would not be stopped. So e4 is logical. And now g4, making sense again, which is just to try and break up this structure, because otherwise there is no way to break it up. Because the only other way to break it up is if white somehow were to capture this pawn with his knight. But you might notice that even if the knight were to had this option, black would simply recapture, and after king takes, this pawn would run up the board. So this structure cannot be broken down. In the meantime, the queenside pawns, they're going to fall one after another. Therefore, white played g4, f takes g4, knight takes e4. So one of the advantages is that the pawn on c5 is now defended. a5, another good move. The idea behind this move is to, first of all, to get that little bit closer to the promotion square. And secondly, notice how the pawn, the a pawn for white, is fixed on a light square. So this one is on a dark square, giving a little bit more problems for black to actually capture it. But in the case of this a pawn, bishop to b3 is coming in next, and the pawn will fall. So king f4, and indeed bishop to b3. White is simply sort of waiting, as he has no real plan. King f4, bishop to b3. Notice the knight is tied down to this defense. And now king goes to e3. You might be asking, why not capture the pawn on g4 now that the bishop is no longer defending? Well, it's a playable move, but the problem is after bishop takes a4, king f4, bishop c2, The threat is very simple. Capture the knight and then king takes pawn, and then as the black king will try and stop the advance of the a pawn, he may succeed in doing so, but the black king will in the meantime go after the h pawn, and then this pawn will decide. We already saw this idea. It's a very common idea. And yeah, just as a little side note, study your king and pawn endgames. There is a lot of material available to you on this website for king and pawn endgames, and I urge you to work on that area of your game, simply because it has a huge practical benefit. You're going to have a lot of king and pawn endgames as well as rook and pawn endgames over the course of your chess career. Okay, so that's a little bit of an aside, but the point is that after, let's say after this line, king takes, king f4, bishop c2, knight c3, a4, this pawn simply cannot be stopped. So black's plan is just king takes pawn on c5, move the king on over, and promote. And notice one unfortunate detail for white, which is that if the bishop was of a different color, then after a move like knight takes a4, bishop takes a4, then king g3, king takes, king g2, king wherever, and king h1. If this bishop was a dark squared bishop, we had the exact same position, but let's say the bishop was on b4, it would be a theoretical draw. And the reason for this is that in the case of a rook's pawn, the bishop, in order for it to be a win, the bishop needs to be of the same color as the promotion square. So here, h1, we need a light squared bishop. And if we had an a pawn instead, and the white king was over here, then we would need a dark squared bishop. But here, Fischer was, of course, very much aware of the fact that he had the right color bishop. If he is to remain with only one pawn, this is the pawn he wants to remain with, the one on h7. And of course, Uhlmann would have been aware as well. So therefore, that is why Uhlmann didn't chase after this kind of a line. So after bishop to b3, white instead played the move king to e3. Black captured on a4, and now white went king to d2. Black played h6, knight f6, chasing after the g4 pawn. It cannot be defended, but king takes c5, knight takes g4, and now h5. So more or less these last few moves have been quite normal. And now after knight e3, I want to just sort of focus on this next move, which is very nice. It's king to d4. And so that's a perfectly centralized and active and quite advanced king for black, threatening to either, in some variations, perhaps support the promotion of this pawn if the king could land perhaps on b2. And in other situations, just threatening to run over to the king's side and collect the h-pawn and then overwhelm white. Although, if he does pursue this particular strategy, he needs to be especially careful, because as we know, if white could only exchange his knight for this pawn and then drop his king over to the corner, then there is no way for black to win king, bishop, and pawn of a light square against the king that has access to this corner. White plays knight f1, presumably intending to achieve exactly this. But black, a clever move here, king e5. Now in the event of knight to g3, black would have the move pawn to h4. And there is no knight f5, there is no continued harassment of this pawn. I feel that I should add one important detail actually here, which is how to convert this position as black. Well, in the event of king to c3, black would play bishop to b5. And here, let's say king to b3, king f4. And it's just important, the bishop to b5 is a useful move as it restricts the white knight. And here the e4 and f5 squares are being controlled by the black king for now. And now after king to a3, interesting move, king to g4. Black has to be careful. He cannot, of course, take this knight because of the theory that we've recently mentioned. And so he plays king to g4. From here, he's now covering the h5 square in addition to the f5 square. White goes king to b3 and now bishop to d7. The idea behind bishop to d7 and king to g4, the combination, is that now the black king wants to go to h3. But the problem is that if he does so here, after king to b3, he plays the move king to h3. This would be a huge blunder. Knight f5 is picking up that h4 pawn, and it's a draw. So therefore, bishop to d7, covering that f5 square is essential. King back to a3, and now king to h3. So of course, white has been trying to call black's bluff. He knows that black cannot actually take the knight, but after king to b3, let's throw in a4 check. This is a useful move anyway, king a3, and now king takes h2. This is the problem for white. Black goes not after the knight, but after the pawn instead. And it's not actually possible for white to hold on to the pawn, because if he plays a move like knight f1, then after king to g2, the knight is under attack, knight e3 check, and king takes h2 is a problem. Now, white could actually still continue trying to set traps like knight to d2, the idea being that in the event of king takes h2, then knight f3 is coming in with a fork. But of course, black has a few ways of countering this, involving covering the relevant squares like f3 with his bishop. So some moves such as bishop to c6 should be sufficient. And eventually the pawn will fall and black will safely guide the h-pawn forward. It's important to note as well that black was able to toy with these pawns, and he really uses the big benefit of the bishop over the knight, which is its scope. Right? The knight has the flexibility that it can jump from light to dark squares, but the bishop has tremendous scope. And so with pawns on both sides of the board, we see that really white is in trouble. And on top of this, the pawns, they couldn't be more laterally separated, but on top, in addition, we have this other property, which is rook pawns are extremely problematic to stop for knights, because the knights are much more restricted. They cannot, for instance, unlike a central pawn, they cannot stop it from several different sides because the board, the squares run out, right? So the white knight is much more limited. Let's imagine if it's trying to stop this pawn from advancing and the pawn is on h3, let's say, it must try and prevent h2 from occurring. And in order to prevent h2, the knight must be placed on one of these squares, right? So it's a pretty limited choice. There are no squares on the other side of the pawn simply because the board has run out. And in the event that the pawn reaches h2, it's even worse because the white knight is now restricted to only 2 squares from where it can actually cover the promotion. So the number of squares are very limited, and as a result, rook's pawns are the best type of pawn to have as a general rule when you're battling a knight that is trying to stop you from promoting. Therefore, the game didn't continue like this, but instead, Uhlmann chose king e3. Now black played bishop to b3. White went knight g3, and somehow I see no more moves. It appears that here white resigned. Why he resigned? Well, the game may have continued as follows. Let's say a4. The white king must go to d2. There is no time to capture the pawn because a3, knight f4, a2, and that pawn is simply promoting. Therefore, after a4, king d2, and now h4. Crucial for black to conserve this pawn because otherwise, once again, we have that draw. Knight, let's say, steps back to e2. It's not necessary, but we already saw what might happen if white simply leaves his knight there for a while. Black will instead go after the h2 pawn. a3, knight to c1, perhaps attempting to bring the king over to defense of this pawn. But here, one of the several ways to win, but the simplest is bishop to c4. Once again, establishing that dominant dynamic of the bishop over the knight because we have 2 squares in between on rank or file. And so we can see here that the knight's jumps, being on the corner, are actually completely restricted. White could play the move king to c3, targeting the bishop on c4. And now king d5 should be sufficient. King will have to go back to c2. And now a2 is most human to my mind. King b2 has to be played, and now king goes over to e4. The simple plan for black is to collect this pawn and then promote. And well, what to be done? White should take the pawn on a2 because otherwise his knight is paralyzed because wherever it moves, it will be captured by the bishop and it'll be a winning pawn endgame. And the king is also tied down to the defense of this pawn. So knight takes a2. But the point is that bishop takes a2, king takes a2, king f3. the white king is simply far too many squares away from any kind of a draw. If the white king could meet king takes h2 with the move king f2, or indeed the move king f1, this would be a theoretical draw. But of course, that's not going to happen. Let's say king b2, white has king g2, king c2, king takes pawn. And here, even if the white king was one square closer, even then he would go king to e2, and now black would win with king g2. So he's still a couple of tempi away. After king d2, king g2, the black king is on a key square, and therefore no way to prevent promotion. So yeah, Uhlmann, of course, didn't feel the need to test Fischer's technique. We didn't see any of these kind of variations unfolding over the board. Okay, well, that concludes our coverage of, in the first place, good knight versus bad bishop, and now with two game examples of a good bishop versus a bad knight. Or more than anything, I would say with this first game, it wasn't so much that in the beginning it was an excellent bishop versus a bad knight. It's just that, well, in the beginning it was quite a balanced game, but Bobby Fischer simply outplayed Wolfgang Uhlmann and sort of maximized all of the potential in his position and made his minor piece as good as possible. And Uhlmann was simply outclassed and was left with what in the beginning was quite a good knight, a certainly very aesthetically well-placed knight. And, you know, by the end of a few subtle exchanges and improvements in the position, Uhlmann's entire position collapsed quite quickly, right? By the moment where I would say that after this move, a4, it's almost impossible to hold this position. I suspect this is already lost, even with perfect play from white. And notice that this was only a mere 9 moves after the original position here, knight d5, where at first sight it appears that white is the one with the superior piece. So a superbly instructive game, not the only instructive example of Bobby Fischer winning the bishop versus knight battles. I would recommend that you guys look through Bobby Fischer games and perhaps even place a special emphasis on how he handled the bishop in these kind of bishop versus knight battles, because he is one of the greatest of all time at managing this unique imbalance. So with that said, we wrap up the sections involving good knight versus bad bishop and good bishop versus bad knight. And now the final section that we're going to look at is just a superior minor piece, which in this case we're going to show examples of a bishop of the same color and also a bishop of the opposite color. So bishop versus bishop of the same color and bishop versus bishop of opposite color. So I shall see you for those games now in a second.